Hello, my friends. Yesterday, the German newspaper Der Spiegel published a leaked transcript of a phone conversation that took place Monday between Volodymyr Zelensky, EU leaders, and Mark Rutte. And shortly after Der Spiegel released it, the Wall Street Journal stepped in to confirm that what we're about to examine is accurate. This is not promising for European leaders. Before diving into it, we must also note Vladimir Putin's visit to India and the very clear messages he sent, messages that EU leadership will not want to hear. Meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron is in China pleading with Xi Jinping to support the European Union against Russia, which shows a complete misunderstanding of how the global balance of power has shifted. Let's begin with Politico's breakdown of the leaked transcript because it's revealing, according to the transcript published by Der Spiegel, Emmanuel Macron warned that the United States could betray Ukraine on territorial agreements, saying there was a major danger for Zelensky. Macron claims the U.S. might abandon Ukraine, but betrayal requires friendship. Empires do not have friends. They have vassals, interests, and proxies. For the last 60 years, the United States has only had those three categories. Which does Ukraine fall under? It's certainly not friendship. We grade, then we have Friedrich Merz, who told Zelensky to be extremely careful in the coming days because they are playing with you and with us, referring to Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who spent 5 hours in deep discussions with President Vladimir Putin this week. On one level, Merz is right. Trump wants to create the illusion that EU leaders and Zelensky still have a seat at the table, that negotiations are pending. But in truth, the Trump administration has already decided the outcome long ago. The leaders of Europe and Zelensky understand what is coming. They just refuse to accept it. That's why Trump is letting his envoys play this game of delay, small incentives, and illusions of influence. I maintain that the key decisions were made at the Alaska summit. Everything since then has been the details being tied up, and the Europeans can't accept that they no longer have a say. This leaked call demonstrates precisely that. Finnish leader Stubb agreed with Merz, saying, "We cannot leave Ukraine and Volodymyr alone with these guys," sparking support from Rutte. NATO declined to comment. But why exactly are these EU figures so terrified of Zelensky being alone with Kushner and Witkoff? They claim these men are inexperienced, mere businessmen. But that's actually the point. They speak Zelensky's language. Trump has learned from his first presidency. The real threats are those in the shadows trying to manipulate him. He now prefers trusted channels. That's why Kushner and Witkoff hold these roles loyalty over bureaucracy. But the hypocrisy is glaring. When the previous leak occurred, the call between Kirill Dmitriev, Yuri Ushakov, and Witkoff, everyone in the West eagerly weaponized it, claiming Russia was manipulating Trump. No one condemned the leak itself. Now that it involves EU leadership, suddenly leaks are harmful to diplomacy. The double standard speaks for itself. The Wall Street Journal explains it even more clearly. The US and Russia are negotiating the end of the conflict with Kyiv without Europe involved. Europe is irrelevant to the final outcome. This is the humiliation and desperation we are witnessing. European leaders trying to crash a party they were never invited to. Let's move to Vladimir Putin because he stated once again what should no longer shock anyone. Russia will take the Donbass. Not maybe. Not if negotiations go well, it will happen. Militarily or by agreement. Western analysts pretend to be surprised, but this objective has been crystal clear from the beginning. Putin emphasized this again in an interview with India Today. The Donbass must come under Russian control within its full administrative borders. What does that mean for the conflict? Russia will keep fighting until this is achieved, and that will take time because Ukrainian forces still hold critical strongholds like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. These cities will not fall easily. At their current pace, Russia likely needs another year. The real question is whether Ukrainian troops can survive another year. And unless Zelensky suddenly accepts Putin's demands, which seems impossible, the war continues on the battlefield, not at a negotiating table. Putin also commented on his meeting with Trump's representatives in Moscow. He described it as necessary, meaning necessary for the Americans to finally understand the true balance of power. The West arrogantly assumed Russia could be coerced into surrender. Now, reality has corrected that delusion. Russia is negotiating from a position of absolute strength, and everyone now knows it. Putin then spoke on the G7, clearly stating Russia has zero interest in returning. He pointed out their declining role in the global economy, especially Germany's recession, and contrasted that with Russia's rising role within BRICS. The West keeps dangling acceptance as if it's a prize. Putin rejects it outright. Russia is independent and thriving outside Western control. His visit to India reinforces that. Modi welcomed Putin with high honors. The Indian military band playing the Russian anthem. India and Russia are expanding trade toward $100 billion annually by 2029, pursuing joint development of military technologies like the Su-57 and integrating financial systems, real de-dollarization in action. This is where power is shifting. BRICS is rising while the G7 shrinks. And Putin is showing the world that Europe is no longer a driver of global policy, merely a passenger who refuses to realize the car has already changed direction. Macron's trip to China illustrates this perfectly. He sat with Xi Jinping, pleading for a moratorium on strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure. He wasted a rare bilateral meeting to push a proposal Xi would obviously reject. Instead of strengthening ties with the world's rising superpower, Macron clung to a failed narrative of European dominance. Europe refuses to accept that it is no longer a great power. The conflict in Ukraine has exposed the truth. Europe talks, Russia acts. Then we have EU Commissioner Andrius Kubilius insisting Europe must craft its own peace plan for Ukraine just in case Article 5 suddenly becomes meaningless. A statement like that 4 years ago might have signaled awakening, but now it's desperation. Europe has exhausted its leverage. 30,000 plus sanctions have failed. Military stockpiles are depleted. Economies are strained. They rely on frozen Russian assets to fund Kyiv. They can plan whatever they want, but without power, plans are meaningless. 4 years too late, Europe has lost relevance, lost credibility, and lost the ability to shape the future. Only two nations will decide Ukraine's fate. Russia, the United States. Europe will watch from the side. This is the geopolitical reality Western elites refuse to accept. But denial won't change the outcome already in motion. The United States likes to pretend it has the Midas touch, that any nation it supports will suddenly prosper, grow, and see gold everywhere. But we know exactly what happens when the United States puts its hands on a country. We've seen it repeatedly for the last 40 years. And the outcome is always the same. Destruction, dependency, and decline, disguised as democracy promotion. Yet, according to Senator Marco Rubio, if Ukraine gets the American touch, it will surpass the Russian economy within 10 years. This bizarre fantasy perfectly captures the delusional Western narrative surrounding the conflict in Ukraine. Today is Thursday, December 4th, and what is unfolding inside the European Union should concern anyone capable of critical thought. Yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen presented EU leaders with two so-called options for how to use the frozen Russian assets. She packaged them as choices, freedom, democracy, and decision-making. But these two roads lead to the exact same destination: deeper financial sacrifice for European citizens and a heavier burden on taxpayers already crushed beneath economic stagnation. This is the reality behind the slogans and moralizing coming out of Brussels. Let us examine these options clearly. The first solution is EU-level borrowing, raising capital from financial markets, using the EU budget as collateral, then sending this capital to Ukraine as a loan. The loan will be paid back by EU member states over time. It doesn't take a degree in finance to understand what that means. Direct pressure on European taxpayers. European budgets are already stretched to the brink. Germany's pension crisis under Friedrich Merz, France's endless pension woes under Macron, Romania under austerity measures, and Belgium plagued by paralyzing budget disputes. Pushing these nations further over the edge is reckless at best, intentionally destabilizing at worst. And suppose European leaders do force this policy through. What happens to the money once Ukraine receives it? Zelensky has already made his intentions clear. If the war ends soon, he claims the funds would help rebuild the country. But if the war continues, and that is the far more likely scenario, the money will go directly into weapons purchases. So when the time eventually comes for rebuilding, what funds will Europe use then? More frozen Russian assets? There won't be any left because they will have already been burned to prolong the fighting. Which brings us to the second option, a reparation-style loan using the cash balances of frozen Russian assets held in European institutions. These funds, according to Brussels, would be loaned to Ukraine now, but would eventually have to be repaid when Russia pays reparations. Even a child could identify the absurdity in this scheme. Russia will absolutely demand its money back, and when Europe inevitably fails to repay it, Moscow will take Brussels to court. Perhaps some EU lawyers believe they would win such a case. Even if they did, the consequences would be enormous. Investors worldwide would conclude that funds deposited in the EU are not safe. Capital would flee, investment would shrink, and once again, taxpayers would be forced to cover the shortfall. Different mechanism, same disastrous result. There is one critical difference. Option 1 requires unanimous approval among EU members, meaning leaders like Viktor Orban can stop it. Option 2 only needs a qualified majority, and that is far easier to achieve. This distinction reveals everything. Brussels knows option 1 is too fragile. So option 2 is the real goal, a geopolitical maneuver designed to bypass dissent inside the Union. Belgium, however, is not staying silent. Its foreign minister, Maxime Prévost, has declared that even the concept of using Russian assets for such loans is fundamentally wrong. He isn't merely objecting to legal wording, he is rejecting the moral and financial logic at its core, as he should. Taking another nation's money under the assumption that there will be no consequences is a fantasy only Western elites can believe. The consequences will come, and they will last for decades. Ordinary Europeans will pay for decisions they never agreed to and never benefited from. This brings us to one of the EU's greatest hypocrisies. The Ukrainian parliament has now removed Russian from the list of languages protected under the European Charter for regional or minority languages. This charter exists to protect minority groups and linguistic rights, rights European leaders loudly celebrate when it suits them. They defended minorities in Kosovo. They invoke minority protection endlessly, except when the minority in question is ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Those protections vanish instantly. Why? Because Brussels only cares about human rights selectively. Principles are nothing more than tools to justify geopolitical decisions. The second great contradiction concerns sovereignty. EU leaders love shouting that only Ukraine can decide its future, and yet when actual EU member states like Hungary or Slovakia act independently to defend their national interests, they are attacked, mocked, ostracized. Viktor Orban's visit to Moscow caused outrage among European elites. But Orban is the elected leader of a sovereign state. He needs no permission from Brussels to pursue diplomacy. Sovereignty only applies, it seems, when Brussels approves of the decision. This hypocrisy is why Brussels rhetoric fails to resonate with ordinary Europeans. Every statement is built on sand values invoked selectively, laws twisted to accommodate agendas, truth reshaped to suit the narrative of the day. And then we hear people like Radosław Sikorski proclaiming that the EU's funding decision will determine the course of the war. This is an admission of defeat. Years ago, the West promised sanctions would cripple Russia. When that failed, they promised weapons would turn the tide. Now, funding is supposedly the decisive card. If financing is the last hope, it means everything else has already failed, and spectacularly so. Sikorski claims that if Putin sees Europe is prepared to fund Ukraine for 2 or 3 more years, he will be forced to reconsider Russia's position. As if Russia has not already endured and overcome 4 decades of Western pressure, sanctions, and economic warfare. As if a nation that has survived 2 world wars, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and countless Western interventions will suddenly surrender because Europe risks bankrupting itself. In truth, Sikorski is preparing his excuse. If peace is eventually negotiated between Washington and Moscow, Europe will falsely claim credit, arguing that their financial resolve forced Russia to compromise. The narrative is already being scripted. Meanwhile, We have the catastrophic realities on the ground. Reuters, hardly a pro-Russian outlet, reports that Ukraine is facing demographic collapse, a population crisis now and for decades ahead. Who will rebuild the nation when the war ends? Ukraine has already lost vast segments of its working-age population to death, disability, or immigration. Wars leave demographic scars that last generations. Russia still feels the demographic wounds of the First and Second World Wars today. Ukraine's wounds may prove worse. Yet the West insists on a strategy that only accelerates this collapse. Then comes Marco Rubio with perhaps the most absurd statement of all, that a U.S. brokered peace would guarantee Ukrainian security, prosperity, sovereignty, and even allow Ukraine's GDP to surpass Russia's within a decade. Russia, whose economy has already surpassed Germany's. Russia, a resource superpower with demographic, industrial, and energy advantages Ukraine never had, even before the war. But Rubio insists that a simple touch from Washington transforms everything into gold. We have watched this touch destroy entire regions: Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria. None became prosperous. None saw security. None saw democracy. All became failed states or shattered societies. And yet, Rubio repeats this myth with confidence, as if people no longer possess memories. There is no polite or optimistic way to analyze such statements. They are delusional at best, intentionally fraudulent at worst. They serve only to prolong a conflict that has already cost Ukraine its future. So I will close here. The European Union is cornering itself economically. Ukraine is collapsing demographically. The Western narrative no longer matches reality in any measurable way. The only question that remains is how much more Europe is willing to sacrifice before admitting that its strategy, not Russia's, is the true cause of its failures. Take care, and until next time,